The wind moaned through the valley like a lonely hymn. Briar Hollow clung to the mountain's edge, a scattering of cottages and smoke, half swallowed by snow. It was a place forgotten by roads and mercy, where the living moved quietly, and the dead never seemed too far behind. Elias Ward lived at the village's farthest edge, in a house that leaned toward the cliff as though it too longed to fall. The cottage was old, built with his own hands decades ago, when his wife's laughter filled the rooms and the scent of stew or honey bread lingered in the air. Now it smelled of damp wood, wax, and thyme. He sat by the hearth, the fire little more than a sulking glow. Before him, on the small table, rested a portrait framed in splintered oak, a woman's face, soft and kind, with eyes painted so gently they seemed on the edge of breathing. "Evening again," Elias murmured, voice roughened by age and disuse. "The snow's early this year. You used to say winter made the house feel smaller. I suppose you were right." He touched the glass with a trembling fingertip, tracing the outline of her cheek. "If you were here, you'd tell me to eat, or shave, or stop talking to ghosts." The fire hissed softly, and he gave a faint smile, one that never reached his eyes. He reached for a cracked mug of tea, now cold, and took a sip anyway. Outside, a shutter banged loose in the wind. The cottage shuddered, dust falling from the rafters like ash. Elias turned his head toward the window. Beyond it, the world was swallowed in white snow drifting endlessly between pine and stone. Somewhere out there, wolves were said to roam again. But it wasn't wolves the villagers feared most. They whispered of her, the Red Lady, the one who walked the ruins when the moon rose full. Elias had heard the stories for years, told by men with trembling hands and drink-warmed courage. A pale woman, they said, wrapped in red silk that never froze. Her eyes burned black as coals. She lured the lonely, the grieving, and the desperate into her domain, never to return. "Superstition," Elias muttered to himself, rising slowly from the chair. His joints crackled like old wood. He took the kettle from the hook above the fire and poured what little water he had left. "Ghosts aren't half as cruel as people." He stepped toward the window, brushing frost from the glass with the sleeve of his coat. The village below looked small, smothered by snow. Smoke rose in thin lines from a few chimneys, neighbors who pitied him but never called. He couldn't blame them. Grief made a man an echo. A shape moved in the snow near the edge of the forest. Elias squinted. For a heartbeat, he thought he saw something crimson flicker between the trees, not the warm red of fire, but a darker, colder hue like the color of a wound. He blinked, and it was gone. The kettle whistled, startling him back. "Getting old," he sighed, shaking his head. "Seeing things now, Lydia." He spoke her name softly, as if afraid to wake something sleeping in the walls. When he sat again, he pulled his chair closer to the hearth. His hands hovered near the flame, fingers stiff and thin as roots. On the mantel rested a few relics, her comb, a dried rose, a silver ring too small for his own hand. The little altar of a man who couldn't move on. "You'd laugh at me if you could see it," he said, glancing at the portrait. "A man of 60, talking to paint." He leaned back, listening to the house creak around him. The fire's glow dimmed, casting strange shapes on the walls like figures dancing where there was no music. For a moment, the air grew cold enough to sting his breath. He frowned, rubbing his arms. The window shutter had blown open again, though he could have sworn he latched it. Elias rose and crossed the room. The wind poured in like a whisper. He pushed the shutter closed and turned, then stopped dead. Across the room, behind his chair, a figure flickered in the corner of his vision, tall, slender, and clothed in something red that shimmered faintly before dissolving into air. Elias stood still for a long while, his pulse steady but slow, like an old clock refusing to wind down. "Maybe the stories keep themselves alive," he said at last, almost kindly. He closed the latch, bolted the door, and went back to his seat. The portrait caught the last light of the fire. He looked at it once more, voice gentler now. "I'll go tomorrow, Lydia, into the forest. There's talk of old ruins up there. Maybe the ground's soft enough to plant, or maybe there's work to be had. A man should still earn his bread, even if no one's waiting for him to share it." The wind answered through the chimney, carrying a sound that was almost like a sigh, soft, feminine, and distant. Elias lifted his head but didn't look toward the window again. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Good night, love." Outside, snow fell heavier. Between the trees at the forest's edge, something stirred, the faintest ripple of red in a world of white. The Red Lady was listening. The path into the forest smelled of old rain and iron. Elias kept his pace steady, as one keeps a metronome against a storm, not hurried, not slow, simply persistent. Dawn had thinned the sky to a pale linen, and the trees stood like columns in a cathedral that had once worshipped sun. He had learned to walk with the ache in his chest, as if it were a companion rather than a wound. It steadied him more than it weakened him. He thought of the things he needed to fix. The broken gate, the leaky barn, the fence that leaned because no one could lift it properly anymore. Work, he told himself, would keep his hands honest and his thoughts from folding inward. There was pride in labor, even when the labor was only to keep a life from dissolving. The estate found him as if it had been waiting for such a purpose. Stone rose out of the undergrowth in collapsed ramps and lichen-split pillars. Iron railings, once proud, twisted like the ribs of a tired beast. Where a fountain might once have sung, a frozen basin held black roses, petals the color of spilled ink, edges rimed with delicate frost. They shivered without moving, a garden that had learned to hold its breath. Elias paused at the threshold. The gate hung on one hinge and creaked with a weary complaint when he pushed. The air inside tasted of cold and something older, like a memory long kept in the bottom of a drawer. He moved through the courtyard as one crossing the belly of a sleeping animal, careful and slow, his boots sending up small puffs of powdered snow. Light pooled in the windows like soft secrets. In the great hall, tattered drapes clung to shadows. Portraits hung crooked on the walls, faces turned to one another as if to gossip about the passage of time. Elias ran a hand along the back of a bench and found the surface rough with age and a fine dust of ash. Here, clearly, had been a life that was not his, the kind of life belonging to people with names carved into stone and lace curtains that never yellowed. A breeze moved through the hall and brought with it the scent of roses and iron, blood and bloom braided into one. The lantern in Elias' hand trembled. He tightened his grip. He should have felt trespassers' shame. He should have turned back, satisfied with his courage and a story to tell the neighbors. Instead, the place wrapped around him like a question. He heard the footfall before he saw the figure, a soft, deliberate step that belonged to someone who walked the same way through centuries. She appeared at the top of a blackened stair, descending with the surety of a ruler. Her clothing was the color of old garnet, not the garish red of festival, but something deeper and colder, like the inside of a wound seen through frost. The garment fell in clean, impossible lines, and the air around her seemed to dim, as if light hesitated at her hem. Her face was not what the stories had promised, not grotesque, not ravenous. She was tall and pale as bone, with cheekbones that traced the path of time. Her hair, dark as a raven's wing, fell in a sheet behind her. Her eyes, those had been the whispered terror, coal-black and unreadable, or so the villagers had said. Now they regarded Elias with a curiosity that felt less like malice and more like study. "Who are you to walk in my halls?" she asked, voice low and shaped like the inside of a bell. It held an accent that had no home in the valley. It could have been the language of kings and of old storms. Elias straightened, the years knitting his spine into a posture he never used but could manage when necessary. He met her gaze and felt, absurdly, like a man in a church caught smiling at a stranger's hymn. The cold did not frighten him. Grief had installed a colder roommate long ago. "I'm Elias Ward," he said plainly. "I come for work. There's need of hands, perhaps. I can mend walls, fix locks, tend a garden if it'll feed a roof." The woman's lips curved, but not unkindly. "You trespass on land turned bitter," she said. "Few who come here speak of mending. Most come to pry at old bones." He shifted his satchel, heavy with nothing and something like resolve. "There's a house in Briar Hollow with only one chair. I can't sit and wait for it to fall in around me. I have to earn my bread." She studied him a long beat, as if counting the smallness of his chest and the seriousness of his hands. For a moment the estate was silent except for the faint susurration of those black roses, like a crowd of small, patient mouths. "You are old for a man who thinks he still has time," she said finally. "Why does a man of your years come into ruins that sing of endings?" Elias' tongue tasted of rust and honesty. He did not bother with the pretense of youth. "I've loved and I've buried my love," he said. "I've tightened my belt for too many months. A man learns the value of the coin in his pocket and the sound of silence. I'm too old for love, ma'am, but I can work." The sound of his words hung between them like smoke. The woman's expression became something unreadable, a shifting of shadows and memory. She stepped down from the stair until she stood at his shoulder, a presence that felt both vast and intimate. Up close, her skin was the color of moon-washed milk, smooth as preserved paper. "Love and work are both hungers, mortal," she said, and her voice was a tide pulling at old sand. "One just kills slower." Elias felt something in his chest loosen, not from fear but from the recognition of a truth told plainly. In their small lives, hunger took many shapes, the need for bread, for warmth, for touch. Sometimes it was only a difference in how quickly things withered. "You don't seem like the sort who would lie," she added after a silence that smelled of iron and rose. "You have sorrow, but not the teeth of a criminal. There is a steadiness in you that betrays despair, not malice." "I only hope my steadiness is worth the price of a night's shelter," Elias said. She considered him, and when she spoke next there was a softness that would have been laughable in another woman, impossible in one who had earned a crown of shadows. "One night," she decided. "You may keep one night beneath my roof, for your courage." Relief washed through Elias in a small, private way, not the triumphant sort, but like waking to find your hand still in someone else's from a dream. He bowed his head, used to the small acts of courtesy that remained when everything else had been spent. "Thank you," he said simply. She inclined her head, and the gesture felt like being permitted to enter a long-closed chapter. The roses rustled in their frozen stillness, and somewhere beyond the great windows, the forest sighed as if relieved of a small burden. As Elias followed her through shadowed halls toward a room that smelled of lavender and iron, he carried with him the thought that perhaps ruins did not only keep the dead. Perhaps they kept the kinds of matches that could still kindle warmth between two very different kinds of cold. Morning light never reached the ruins. The air inside the estate carried a dim silver hue, as if it had forgotten the color of warmth. Elias Ward stood beneath the arched entryway with a broom in one hand and a bucket of melted frost in the other. His breath came out in faint clouds, the only sign of life in the cavernous stillness. He began to clean, as he always had in the days when work meant survival. Dust rose like ghosts from forgotten floors. Each stroke of the broom whispered across marble veined with cracks. Tapestries drooped, their stories devoured by time, battles, coronations, dances now blurred into shadow. He didn't question why he stayed. Perhaps because he had nowhere else to go. Perhaps because, in the silence of the ruin, his wife's absence hurt a little less. The hallways were strange. Mirrors stood against the walls, every one veiled in thick silk, the fabric pulsing faintly when the wind moved. Elias touched one, curious, and for a moment it seemed warm beneath his fingertips, too warm. He stepped back. Everywhere he turned, he found traces of life long ended. Portraits of kings and queens, faces too pale and sharp to be mortal. Chandeliers glinted above him, though no candles burned. In a corner of the ballroom, roses grew from cracks in the marble, black roses with petals slick as spilled ink. He knelt beside one. The scent was faintly metallic. When his sleeve brushed a thorn, a bead of red appeared on his wrist. The rose drank it. He froze, watching as the wound closed almost instantly. The petals quivered as if sighing. Elias shuddered and rose to his feet. From the shadows above the grand staircase, Vyrha watched. She had not slept since the previous night, had not truly slept in a century. Her kind did not dream, but this man's presence stirred something old, something that remembered. He moved without fear, without reverence. He did not ask for gold or warmth or mercy. He simply worked. Her voice, when it came, was soft as silk brushing over glass. "You clean a dead house as though it were your own." Elias turned, startled but not afraid. He bowed slightly, wiping dust from his hands. "Ma'am, I've lived in a dead house before. Habit sticks." The faintest curve touched her lips. "You mock grief." He shook his head. "No, I just learned to speak to it kindly." She stepped into the half-light, her gown the color of spilled wine, her skin moon-pale. The air around her shimmered faintly, and shadows bent in her presence like reeds in a current. "What do you seek here, mortal?" she asked. "Work," he said simply. "Something to keep my hands busy." Vyrha tilted her head, studying him. "Not warmth, not gold, not youth. I'm too old for dreams," he murmured. "And too tired for lies." She almost smiled again. "You are not the kind they send here." "I wasn't sent," he replied. "I walked." Silence hung between them. Somewhere in the distance, the black roses rustled though there was no wind. At last, Vyrha turned away. "You may stay. The east wing remains untouched by decay. Clean it if you must. I wish to see what remains of your human order." He nodded. "As you wish, ma'am." As she left, her presence faded like the last note of a forgotten song. Elias worked through the afternoon. He repaired a fallen doorframe, swept corridors, and hummed the songs his wife used to hum when winter pressed too close. The tune was small, almost broken, but it filled the estate like the echo of sunlight through frost. Vyrha listened from the shadows of her throne room. The sound hurt in a way she hadn't felt in centuries. It reminded her of heartbeat and hearthfire, of time when she had known gentleness before hunger replaced it. When he paused to rest, she whispered, though he could not hear her, "You bring the noise of life into my grave." As dusk settled, Elias lit a single candle in the great hall. The flame wavered, and the mirrors behind their veils trembled. Shapes moved faintly beneath the silk, faces perhaps, or memories. He watched one of them too long and thought he saw his wife's reflection, smiling as she used to. When he blinked, it was gone. He whispered her name into the darkness. Vyrha, in her chambers, heard it, and for the first time in an age, she felt her heart remember how to ache. Night fell heavy and soundless upon the mountains. No moon graced the sky, only a strange, reddish shimmer that clung to the frost like memory. Inside the ruins, the long-dead chandeliers began to stir with light, awakening one by one. Candles flared to life, their flames black at the center, breathing shadows instead of warmth. For the first time in centuries, the vampire court of Vyrha gathered. Elias had polished the marble floors until they reflected the chandeliers like dark stars. He had set the table with silver so tarnished it gleamed gray. He did not ask who would eat, or what. When Vyrha commanded, he obeyed, though he could not shake the feeling that the house itself was holding its breath. From the grand staircase, he heard the first voices, smooth, cruel, and ageless. They arrived as whispers and laughter, their footsteps light as silk on stone. They were beautiful, in the way venom glistens before the bite. Men and women draped in garments spun from night itself. Jewels gleamed at their throats, but no heartbeats stirred beneath their skin. Their eyes burned faintly red, their smiles sharp. They bowed to their queen, though some did so with disdain poorly hidden. "Our Lady of Dust awakens at last," said one, a tall noble with silver hair. "Does solitude no longer satisfy, my queen?" Vyrha reclined upon her throne of stone and bone, her expression unreadable. "Solitude starves," she said softly, "even for the dead." Laughter rippled, elegant and poisonous. "And this?" Another sneered, nodding toward Elias, who stood beside the table, hands folded. "Immortal, a servant of sweat and decay among the pure. Tell us, Lady Vyrha, has pity replaced power in your veins?" Vyrha's gaze drifted to Elias. He bowed slightly, avoiding the eyes that glittered like blades. "He cleans what you left to rot," she replied. "Do you know a single one among you who still remembers the dignity of work?" The room stilled for a moment. Then came the low, mocking murmur of amusement. "He will not last the night," one whispered. "Then the feast will not go hungry," another answered. Elias said nothing. He poured the dark wine into their goblets, though it did not smell of grapes. It smelled of iron and something sweetly wrong. The candles dimmed. The music began. It came from no instrument Elias could name, a low humming that vibrated in his bones. The vampires began to move, not walking but gliding, their limbs flowing with unnatural grace. The feast was not a meal but a ritual, a dance of hunger disguised as art. They circled the hall, their laughter echoing through vaulted ceilings. One by one, they chose from the veiled forms that lined the walls, human shapes, pale and still, suspended as if asleep. When the feeding began, Elias froze. It was not savage. It was deliberate, choreographed, almost beautiful, fangs sinking like lovers' kisses, bodies swaying to a rhythm of death. Blood ran down throats like spilled wine, gleaming under candlelight. He stumbled backward, horrified, and his lantern slipped from his hand. It shattered, light spilling across the floor. Every head turned toward him. The music stopped. One of the nobles, the silver-haired man, stepped forward, eyes flaring crimson. "A witness," he hissed. "A trespasser. Shall we finish our hunger properly?" Before Elias could speak, Vyrha's voice cut through the hall, sharp and cold. "No!" The air itself seemed to freeze. "This one works for me." Her words fell like stone in water, rippling through every soul present. The nobles exchanged glances, the silence dense with disbelief. "You protect him?" a woman asked, her voice sweet as poison. "A human, before your court." Vyrha rose from her throne, her gown whispering across the marble. Her eyes gleamed with something fierce, not hunger, but command. "Yes," she said, "he belongs to this house, as do I. Any who spill his blood will answer to me." The silver-haired noble bowed low, but the motion dripped with contempt. "As you decree, my queen." Elias stood trembling, the scent of blood thick in his lungs. The eyes of the court burned into him, envy, hunger, hatred. When the feast resumed, the laughter was colder. The music turned sharp, brittle as ice cracking underfoot. From her throne, Vyrha watched Elias. Her face betrayed nothing, but beneath her composure, something old and dangerous stirred, defiance. Protecting a mortal was a declaration, one her court would not forgive. As dawn approached and the guests vanished into mist, the hall was left drenched in silence once more. Elias stood among overturned goblets and petals of black roses scattered like ash. Vyrha approached quietly, her steps soundless. "You should not have come to the hall," she said. "You saw too much." He met her eyes, still pale with shock. "I've seen enough death, my lady. Yours was the first that looked like grace." Her expression faltered for just a breath, the smallest flicker of sorrow. Then she turned away, her voice distant. "Be careful with such words, Elias Ward. The dead are easily flattered and easily angered." When she vanished into the shadows, the last candle went out, leaving only the faint scent of blood and roses, and the whisper of rebellion taking root in the silence she left behind. The castle was quieter after the feast, quieter than the grave it once resembled. No laughter, no echoes of the court. Only the faint hum of wind through broken glass and the soft, rhythmic sound of Elias Ward sweeping the marble floor where crimson stains refused to fade. Days, or what passed for them in that timeless place, had grown gentler between them. Vyrha kept to her high chambers, rarely descending except to watch him work. Elias repaired what he could. The doors that sagged from their hinges, the stair that groaned with age, the hearth that hadn't seen flame in centuries. She watched him not as a queen, but as something uncertain, like a traveler standing before an unfamiliar horizon. That night she spoke first. He had lit the fire again, and its glow filled the ruined hall with a mortal warmth that didn't belong there. Vyrha lingered in the shadows, wrapped in silver and silence. The flickering light painted her face in restless hues, half divine, half damned. "You labor as if this place were still alive," she said softly. "Why?" Elias straightened his back, his hands blackened from ash. "Because it once was. Things that lived deserve to be remembered, even if they're broken." Her eyes glimmered like shards of garnet. "You speak as if you've buried the world yourself." He smiled faintly. "Just one woman. But she was my world." Silence folded between them, delicate, dangerous. The fire crackled, and somewhere deep in the ruin, a shutter banged in the wind. Vyrha descended the last steps, her gown trailing behind her like a memory made flesh. "Tell me," she said, "what does it feel like, to lose love and still wake each morning as if it might return?" He looked into the fire rather than at her. "It feels like hunger," he said at last. "The kind that no food can quiet." Her gaze softened, ancient sorrow flickering behind it. She drew closer, the air cooling as she moved. "Centuries ago," she murmured, "I too loved a mortal. A poet whose voice could make even the dead pause to listen. He told me I was beautiful as the night, until he decided to love the sun instead." Her lips curved into a bitter half-smile. "He betrayed me to the dawn. I burned for his freedom." Elias turned toward her, startled. "And yet you live." Exist, she corrected. Living is what you do, I merely linger. Her words were silk and sorrow. For the first time, Elias saw the weight she carried, not power but punishment. The immortality that others envied had turned her heart to glass. I don't know much about eternity, he said, but forgiveness can feel longer than that. Her eyes lifted to meet his. For a breath, she said nothing. Then, quietly, you forgive the world that took your wife. I forgive her for leaving it, Elias said, because she didn't want to, and I forgive myself for surviving it. Vyrha studied him as if reading a language she'd forgotten. The flame light trembled across her skin, the faintest echo of color blooming in her pale cheeks. You are not afraid of me, she said. I've been alone longer than fear has company, he replied gently. Something inside her cracked, a soundless fracture, but he saw it in her eyes. She stepped closer, the scent of roses and cold stone enveloping him. Then tell me, Elias Ward, she whispered. What do you see when you look at me? He hesitated, not out of fear, but reverence. I see a woman who's been waiting too long for morning. The words hung between them, heavy and tender. For the first time in centuries, Vyrha smiled, truly smiled. It was small, uncertain, as if her lips had forgotten the shape. Morning, she echoed, almost tasting the word. The candles burned low. The castle's shadows stretched long. At last, Vyrha turned and said, Come, I wish to show you something forbidden. She led him through a corridor Elias had never seen, the air colder with each step. At its end stood a door sealed in iron, etched with runes that shimmered faintly in the dark. With a touch, she undid them one by one, and the air shuddered as the lock released. Beyond it lay a vast balcony, open to the horizon. Elias gasped. He had not realized how high the castle stood. The valley spread beneath them like a map of shadows and stars. The night was thinning, its edge bruised with color. Stand here, Vyrha said, her voice trembling with something close to fear. Elias stepped beside her. The first hint of dawn brushed the distant peaks, pale gold bleeding into silver. Vyrha flinched, turning her face away. Her hand gripped the stone rail, knuckles white. The light kissed her skin, and she trembled. It burns, she whispered, a single tear red as wine slipping down her cheek. It burns, but it's beautiful. Elias reached out, his calloused hand resting gently over hers. She didn't pull away. For a heartbeat, one stolen from eternity, she allowed herself to watch. The world brightened. The frost on the roses turned to dew. The air smelled of beginnings. When the sun finally crested the ridge, Vyrha turned her face toward it, eyes half closed, lips parting as if she could drink the light. For centuries she had hidden from this, and yet, beside him, she endured. Elias spoke quietly, not wanting to break the fragile spell. Sometimes the things that hurt us most are the ones that remind us we're still alive. Vyrha's voice was a breath. Then let me hurt a little longer. The light deepened, and smoke began to rise faintly from her bare shoulders. He tried to shield her, but she shook her head, smiling through the pain. When she finally stepped back into shadow, the sunrise had etched color across her face, a blush not of blood, but of life. She looked at Elias, the mortal who dared to bring dawn into her darkness, and whispered, You should not have shown me this. Now I will never be content with night again. Elias bowed his head. Then maybe it's time you stopped worshipping it. Her laughter was soft, fragile, like the first bird's call at morning. And as the light spilled over the ruins, touching both human and immortal, it seemed the world itself exhaled, as though something lost had finally remembered the shape of hope. The castle's halls had grown darker since the morning. The air hung heavy with whispers, dry, brittle things that crawled through cracks in the walls and gathered in corners where light dared not linger. The court had not forgotten the feast, nor the queen's defiance. They spoke her name like a wound, each syllable seeping with venom. Vyrha, the once untouchable queen of the Red Court, was no longer untouchable. She sat alone in the great hall, her crown, once forged from nightstone, lying forgotten on the floor beside her throne. The fire had gone cold hours ago. She hadn't noticed. She had been listening, to the silence, to the voices that weren't supposed to exist within it, footsteps. They entered without bowing the Council of Ash, her oldest and most dangerous kin. 6 of them, draped in silks the color of graves, eyes glowing faintly with the same unnatural light that once burned in hers. The leader, Lord Sarath, stepped forward. His voice was smooth as marble. "My queen we have come to speak of." "Weakness?" Vyrha's gaze rose slowly. "You mistake mercy for weakness, Sarath." "We mistake sentiment," hissed another, "for rot. You've begun to pity the cattle. You let a mortal live under your roof, feed in your halls, breathe your air. It stains the bloodline. It mocks the throne." Their voices overlapped, echoes of centuries of cruelty, now sharpened by fear. "Love," one spat the word as if it were poison. "You let it poison you again." Vyrha's hand tightened on the armrest of her throne until the stone cracked beneath her grip. "Enough!" The room shuddered. Shadows writhed against the walls, reacting to her command. Yet the council did not retreat. Sarath smiled, bowing his head just enough to mock her authority. "If the Red Queen has forgotten what she is, then perhaps she must be reminded. We cannot allow your compassion to thin the blood that binds us." "Bind yourselves, then," she whispered, "but do not presume to bind me." The flicker of rebellion in her voice ignited fury among them. "You risk the curse," another snarled. "Do you remember what happened the last time the royal blood turned against itself? The earth opened, the sky burned black." "I remember," she said quietly. "I remember burying my own kin to stop it." For a moment, silence returned, brittle, terrified. But when Sarath spoke again, it was with quiet certainty. "You are no longer the queen we followed. The sun has touched your heart and left it soft. The council will convene before the next dusk. Your reign will be reevaluated." He turned to leave. The others followed, their robes whispering across the stone like dry leaves in autumn. When they were gone, Vyrha sat motionless, her breath shallow, though she did not need breath at all. Behind one of the pillars, unseen by the council, Elias Ward stepped into view. His face was pale. He had heard everything. She did not turn toward him. "How long have you been listening?" "Long enough," he said. Her voice was tired. "Then you know what must happen." He shook his head. "You can't fight them alone." "I can't fight them at all." She rose, the folds of her gown sweeping like storm clouds. "The blood of the court is bound by curse. If I raise my hand against my own, the spell that keeps this land standing will break. The rivers will turn black, the sky will fall, the old hunger will wake again. I am both their queen and their prison." Elias stepped closer, eyes burning with something fiercer than fear. "Then what are you going to do?" "I'll give them what they want," she whispered. "My throne, my silence. But not my soul." She finally looked at him, and the centuries of power in her gaze seemed suddenly human. "You must leave, Elias, before dusk. When they rise again, they will come for you first. You are the symbol of everything they despise, the mortal who made their queen remember her heart." He stood firm, jaw set. "I'm not leaving." "Elias, no." He took another step forward, his voice breaking but steady. "I've spent my life running from graves, from hers, from mine. I won't run from yours." Her expression faltered. "If you stay, they'll kill you." He smiled faintly. "If I go, your heart will freeze again." The words struck her harder than any blade. For the first time in centuries, her throat closed with something that felt like pain, real, living pain. She turned away, gripping the edge of the throne as though to steady herself. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you care for something like me?" Elias' reply was quiet, but it carried the weight of truth. "Because even the coldest stars still shine, Vyrha. They just need someone willing to look up." Something inside her cracked again, soft, dangerous. In the silence that followed, she moved toward him, her hand trembling as it reached for his cheek. The contact was cold at first, then warmer, a slow pulse awakening beneath her skin. "I cannot promise your safety," she said. "Then promise me your fight," he answered. Outside, the wind howled through the ruins, carrying the first scent of snow and the faint echo of wings. The council's heralds already gathering for war. Vyrha drew in a breath that tasted like blood and dawn. "So be it," she murmured. "Let them come." Elias nodded once, resolute. "Then we face them together." For a heartbeat, her lips curved not in cruelty or command, but in something softer, almost human. "Together," she echoed. Beyond the castle walls, thunder rumbled where there should have been no storm. The curse, ancient and restless, stirred at the edge of the world. The queen of the Red Court stood no longer alone in her darkness, and the man who had nothing left to lose had just chosen to stand beside her, against death itself. The first scream came with the sound of shattering glass. Elias was in the lower hall, patching a crack in the wall when the noise tore through the castle, the kind of sound that doesn't belong to life or death, but to something breaking between them. He looked up to see a faint red light flicker across the ceiling, as if dawn had arrived far too soon. But it wasn't dawn. It was fire. Through the eastern windows, he saw it blooming, flames swallowing the black rose gardens, their petals curling into embers. The air filled with the smell of smoke and iron, and above it all the echo of inhuman cries. The rebellion had begun. Elias grabbed a rusted sword from a fallen suit of armor, a relic more than a weapon, and ran toward the noise. The once silent corridors of the castle were alive with chaos. The Council of Ash had come with their loyal spawn, pale figures with eyes like coals and movements sharp as storms. They moved through the halls like a plague, their laughter slicing through the roar of fire. And in the heart of it all, Vyrha descended the grand stair, her gown trailing like smoke, her eyes glowing with restrained fury. Shadows gathered around her hands, whispering with the voices of the dead. "Stand down," she commanded, her voice rippling through the air like a pulse. Serath, his face lit by the glow of burning roses, smiled with cold triumph. "We only do what you no longer have the will to do, my queen. Purge the weakness." He flung out his hand, and from his palm erupted a burst of crimson energy, striking the floor beside her, sending shards of marble skyward. The curse trembled, the world itself seemed to gasp. "Do you wish to wake it?" she hissed. Serath's smile widened. "Let the world burn, at least it will remember our names." Their battle began like thunder, ancient power against defiance. The air cracked with bloodlight and shadows, the castle shivering under the force of gods forgotten. Elias ducked behind a fallen column, his heart pounding. He wanted to run to her, to help, but every instinct screamed that mortals had no place in wars of monsters. And yet, when he saw Serath's blade draw a line of blood across her shoulder, when he heard her falter, he moved. He ran toward the west wing, the heart of the castle, where her coffin chamber lay. The fire had already reached it, tongues of flame climbing the walls like eager beasts. The garden outside burned brighter than any dawn. Roses screamed as they turned to ash. The very air was alive with pain. He knew what he had to do. The chamber door was locked by spells and time, but he threw his weight against it again and again until it cracked open. Inside, the room glowed faintly, a sanctuary of moonlight and dust. Her coffin stood at the center, untouched, the only thing in the castle that had never decayed. He tore down the drapes, smothered sparks, broke apart burning beams with his bare hands. The smoke clawed at his lungs, the heat blistering his skin. But he kept going, because if this room fell, she would fall. Behind him, the ceiling groaned. A beam collapsed, striking his shoulder. The pain was blinding. He fell to his knees, choking. Blood filled his mouth, warm and thick. And then she was there. Vyrha burst through the doorway, her power dimmed, her face pale even for her kind. "Elias!" He tried to speak but could only cough. "The fire, it'll take everything." She knelt beside him, her hands trembling. "Foolish man," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You would die for what is already dying." He smiled weakly. "Better to die saving something worth loving." Her breath hitched. She lifted him gently, his head resting in her lap. The world around them blurred, flame and shadow blending into one great heartbeat. "Don't close your eyes," she said. "You'll lose yourself." "I already did," he murmured. "The day she died. You just helped me find what was left." Something inside her broke. For the first time in centuries, tears, real tears, fell down her face, red and glimmering like rubies. "No," she whispered. "Not again. I will not lose another." She bit into her wrist. Dark blood welled up, thick and shining like molten wine. It glowed faintly, whispering with voices older than language. "Drink," she commanded. He stared up at her at the face of death turned desperate. "Vyrha, drink." Her voice cracked like thunder. And when she pressed her wrist to his lips, he obeyed. Her blood burned down his throat, cold at first, then molten, then blinding. It felt as though the fire outside had found its way into his veins. His back arched, his heart convulsed, and the world around him vanished into light. He saw memories that were not his. Empires rising and falling, lovers buried beneath stone, stars bleeding into the sea. He felt her centuries of loneliness, the ache of eternity without warmth. When his body finally stilled, Vyrha held him close, her face inches from his. "Breathe," she whispered. "Please breathe." And he did. But his breath came slow, too deep. His eyes opened, their brown now glimmering faintly with red. His heartbeat was there, but distant, like a drum in another room. "What have you done?" he asked weakly. "I've given you half of me," she said, tears still falling. "Not enough to curse you, but enough to keep you." He reached up, his hand trembling, and brushed a tear from her cheek. "Then it seems we're both half alive now." Outside, the flames began to die. The sky had turned a strange color, neither night nor dawn. Vyrha leaned her forehead against his, whispering words that trembled between love and prayer. "Forgive me, Elias. I have turned you into the thing I hate most, so I wouldn't have to hate the world alone." He smiled faintly. "You didn't damn me, my queen. You just let me stay." The fire's glow dimmed to embers, casting their faces in red and gold. For a moment, amid ruin, blood, and smoke, it almost looked like sunrise again. And somewhere beyond the walls, the curse stirred, awakening to the sound of their mingled hearts. Two rhythms, imperfect but together. The moon rose blood-red over the ruins of the Black Rose Castle. Its light poured through the shattered arches, washing the scorched stones in silver and shadow. The rebellion had been crushed, but victory came hollow, trembling with the cost of what had been lost. Vyrha stood in the courtyard where her ancestors once danced beneath eternal twilight. Her gown, once woven from shadows, now clung to her in tatters. Her crown had melted away in the heat of the fire, leaving only the pale curve of her throat and eyes that burned with centuries of ache. Around her lay the ashes of her court, the Council of Ash reduced to the name they once bore with pride. Sarath was gone, his defiance ended by her hand, but not without consequence. The moment she struck him down, the world had shifted. The curse stirred again. It had slept for an age, sealed by the blood of the first queen, and now it woke, whispering through the wind. The ground beneath her feet pulsed faintly, veins of crimson spreading across the marble, alive with the rhythm of an ancient promise. The queen's heart shall never beat free of shadow. Elias appeared from the smoke, limping, his shirt torn and his hands trembling. The transformation had changed him in ways neither could fully understand. His skin held a faint pallor that caught the moonlight like glass. His eyes shimmered between brown and crimson, as though caught between two worlds. "You shouldn't be walking," she said softly, though her voice carried the weight of command. He smiled, weary, human, stubborn. "You shouldn't be alone." For a long moment, neither spoke. The air smelled of rain and ashes. Somewhere, deep in the castle's heart, a broken clock ticked once, then died. She turned to the ruins of her throne, her expression hollow. "It's begun again, the curse that bound this land to eternal night. My blood feeds it, my rule sustains it. There is no end without my death." Elias stepped closer. "Then end it." Her gaze snapped to him, sharp, pained. "You think it's so simple? If I die, this kingdom rots. Every creature that took breath here will turn to dust, even you." "I was already dying when I found you," he said. "At least now I have something worth dying for." She closed her eyes. "You mortals call that love, we call it madness. Maybe they're the same thing." Vyrha looked at him then, truly looked, and saw not a servant or a mortal, but a reflection of everything she had lost and still longed for. His face was lined with years and sorrow, but his gaze was steady, warm. Human. The pulse of the curse grew louder, the earth splitting, releasing whispers like distant hymns. The moon shuddered in the sky, half hidden behind storm clouds that swirled red with power. The wind tore through her hair as she raised her hands. Shadows coiled around her fingers, black veins crawling up her arms. "It's calling me back," she said. "The throne, the hunger. If I don't return to it, this land will fall. If I do, I will lose what's left of myself." Elias reached her side and took her trembling hand. His skin felt warm, impossibly warm against hers. "Then let me share it," he said. She turned sharply. "No, you are not bound to this darkness." He smiled faintly, his lips cracked, his eyes glistening like the dying embers of a fire. "You gave me your blood to save me. You think I can walk away now, knowing you'll be alone again?" She shook her head, the wind tearing her words apart. If you take this curse, it will consume you. You'll forget the sun. You'll forget laughter, breath, even the taste of warmth. He stepped closer, his voice low but steady. If this is love, then let me bear it with you. For a heartbeat, the world stilled. The fire died to embers. The wind fell silent. The stars above flickered as though holding their breath. Vyrha's eyes filled with something between terror and awe. You don't know what you ask. I know enough, Elias said. I know what it means to live half a life. I'd rather live a cursed one with you than an empty one without. The ground split open before them, a circle of crimson light rising from the stones, casting their shadows long across the courtyard. The curse, ancient and sentient, recognized the offering before it was made. Vyrha trembled, every part of her screaming to refuse. Yet his voice, that soft, weathered tone, steadied her. She lifted her hand and placed it over his heart. Then take it, she whispered. Take what I am and let the night remember us. The moon broke through the clouds, spilling silver light across them both. Its glow caught in her tears, in the faint shimmer of blood between their hands. He leaned forward, his breath uneven. Then we share the hunger. And the hope, she whispered back. Their lips met, a kiss between death and life, frost and flame. The world around them convulsed as the curse accepted its new shape, its new bond. The red veins in the marble dimmed to gold, the air growing still. When they finally parted, their foreheads rested together. The darkness around them was quieter now, no longer screaming, only breathing. Vyrha looked up at the moon, her voice a whisper. Do you feel it? Elias nodded. It's not just pain anymore. No, she said, her lips trembling into a ghost of a smile. It's us. The clouds closed over the moon, breaking its light into shards. For an instant, silver and crimson blended across the sky, a marriage of mortal warmth and immortal cold. And in that light, fleeting and eternal, two shadows stood together amid the ruins, bound by curse and choice, by love that defied both dawn and darkness. As the night swallowed them, a single black rose bloomed from the ashes, its petals edged in silver. The legend would say they vanished, not into death, but into the space between it and life, where love endures when all else fades. The centuries came softly at first, like the slow turn of an hourglass long forgotten. Snow fell upon the Black Rose Valley, covering the ruins in a white silence that no living voice disturbed. The winds that once howled with rage now sang in mournful tones, and time itself seemed reluctant to trespass upon the ground where love had rewritten fate. The villagers called it the Hollow of Two Shadows. None dared to cross the forest after nightfall, for they said the air there still shimmered with the remnants of a curse, and the scent of black roses that bloomed through frost. Only stories remained. Mothers told them to their children, of the widow queen, pale as moonlight, who once ruled a kingdom of blood and sorrow, and of her worker, the mortal man who dared to love her, to serve where angels feared to tread. They said he rebuilt her halls not with gold or steel, but with his heart. That when her enemies rose, he fought beside her though his blood was fragile, though his body was dust waiting to be claimed. And when the world demanded her death, he offered his soul to bear her curse instead. Some told it as tragedy, others as redemption. But none truly knew how it ended because the story never ended. It merely slept. Beneath the frozen ruins, deep in the catacombs where sunlight never reached, Elias and Vyrha rested side by side. They did not lie in coffins, but within a cradle of black marble, the stones shaped like the petals of an enormous rose. Around them, candles burned with eternal flame, fed not by wax, but by memory. The air was rich with the scent of old magic, of dust and quiet devotion. Vyrha slept with one hand over her chest, the faint echo of a heartbeat pulsing once every few hours, a rhythm that would never cease as long as balance endured. Her hair, dark as the void, flowed around her like a shroud of silk. Elias rested beside her, half human still. His aging had halted, but his face bore the faintest lines of the life he once lived. The veins beneath his skin shimmered faintly, neither red nor blue, but silver, the mark of his shared curse. Their hands were entwined, fingers interlaced, the gesture so gentle it defied the stillness of eternity. Between them, the last black rose they ever touched had turned to stone, perfectly preserved, a symbol of their vow and of the fragile peace they had purchased. The world above them changed. Empires rose, then fell again. Forests swallowed the roads, and rivers carved new paths through forgotten graves. Centuries passed like breaths, new languages filled the mountains, and the people who once feared the Red Lady became myths themselves. But always, on nights when the moon turned red, something stirred beneath the ruins. A whisper, a pulse, a vibration in the earth that made the roses tremble and the frost glitter like fire. That was how the balance endured. When light grew too proud, the shadow beneath the mountain deepened, reminding the heavens of humility. When darkness tried to swallow the world, a faint warmth spread from the catacombs, Elias' mortal heart still beating somewhere in the black. The curse, once a prison, had become equilibrium. The queen of vampires and her mortal consort had become the guardians of two worlds, forever holding each other between dawn and night. In the silence of that endless sleep, Vyrha dreamed. She dreamed of sunlight, of standing upon the balcony once more, Elias beside her, as the first morning touched her face. It burned, yes, but softly. It no longer sought to destroy. She dreamed of laughter, his, rough and human, breaking the cold halls with warmth no fire could match. She dreamed of his hands, scarred and trembling, mending what even time dared to abandon. And she dreamed of the words he once spoke, the ones that had chained her heart to hope. "If this is love, then let me bear it with you." Each time the dream faded, her fingers twitched, as though reaching for him in the dark. And every time she found him there, his touch waiting, constant as gravity. They did not need to wake. Their love had become a rhythm that pulsed through the world, a hidden heartbeat that kept the balance between hunger and mercy, between night and day. One night, perhaps 10 centuries later, or 10,000, a traveler wandered through the forest. She was young, cloaked against the cold, her eyes reflecting the flame of her lantern. She found the ruins buried under snow, the roses still blooming black despite the frost. When she brushed her fingers across one petal, the air hummed, faint, musical, alive. She followed the vibration into the earth, through a narrow stair of stone that seemed to remember footsteps from long ago. At the bottom, her lantern caught the shape of two figures lying side by side, untouched by decay, their faces serene. The woman gasped. For an instant, she thought she saw the man's eyes flicker, not open, but aware. The flame in her lantern bent toward them, as if drawn by a pulse older than time itself. And in that faint glow, she saw the marble rose between their hands shimmer faintly, crimson at the edges, as if newly born. The traveler fled in silence, her heart racing, the wind chasing her with whispers. By the time she reached the surface, the moon had turned red again. Above the mountain, the black roses swayed. Their petals caught the frostlight and gleamed with silver veins, as if the night itself were remembering. And so the legend endured, that once, in an age forgotten, love defied death and silence. That somewhere beneath the world, a queen and her workers slept, not as rulers or monsters, but as the balance itself. Wherever darkness grew too heavy, a faint warmth would rise from the roots of the earth, the heartbeat of Elias Ward, echoing still through time. And whenever light grew cruel, a shadow would fall gently over the world, the compassion of Vyrha, shielding mortals from their own flame. They were no longer flesh and blood, nor ghost nor god. They were the pulse between both, the sleep of ages. The forest had long since forgotten its name. What was once called Briar Hollow was now nothing but a dream whispered by mountains, its trails erased by centuries of snow and silence. Yet on certain nights, when the moon swelled red and full, the wind carried a fragrance that did not belong to winter, the scent of roses, sweet and defiant, blooming where nothing should live. No map marked the place anymore. No villager dared approach it. But there are always those who wander not for riches, but for stories, and one such traveler came upon the valley, led not by compass or fate, but by something older. A pull in the chest, a memory that was not their own. The traveler was young, perhaps 20, and weary from crossing lands that seemed to sleep beneath a spell. Their lantern burned low, yet the darkness before them glowed faintly crimson, as though the air itself were remembering a fire. They pushed through the frostbitten brush and emerged into a vast clearing. Before them lay the ruins of the Black Rose Castle, its stones swallowed by ivy and time. Yet the strangest thing was not the silence, nor the way the towers still stood against reason. It was the roses. They covered everything. Red roses, blooming through the cracks of marble, twining up broken pillars, spreading like veins of living flame. Their petals shimmered with moonlight, not merely reflecting it but creating it, casting an otherworldly glow that painted the ruins in hues of blood and silver. The traveler caught their breath. Impossible! They stepped forward carefully. The snow around the roses had melted, leaving the air warm, perfumed. Somewhere, water trickled faintly, the sound of thawing ice. It felt as though the land had been waiting for someone. Every rose seemed alive, breathing with a rhythm almost human. When the traveler brushed one lightly with their gloved hand, its petals opened wider, and from within came a faint sound. A whisper. The traveler froze. The sound was not the wind nor echo, but words, ancient, fragmented like a memory exhaled. Love and work. They leaned closer, heart pounding. The rose trembled, its edges glowing with dim fire. Are both hungers. The words faded into the night. The traveler stood still for a long time, unsure whether to run or kneel. Then, quietly, they spoke into the air. Who are you? But the forest did not answer. Only the roses swayed gently, as though nodding to something unseen. As they moved deeper into the ruins, the scent grew stronger. The air shimmered faintly, heavy with unseen presence. Every step echoed like a heartbeat. And then, through a veil of roses, they saw it. In the center of what had once been a grand courtyard stood two statues, carved from white marble yet touched with veins of red. They stood close together, a man and a woman, entwined not in grandeur, but in quiet, enduring grace. The woman's face was serene, her gaze turned toward her companion with something like sorrow softened by eternity. Her crown was broken, her hair flowing like stone made liquid. The man, rough-hewn, weathered, held her hand in both of his. His eyes, sculpted with impossible tenderness, lifted toward hers. Their fingers were forever interlaced, their bodies leaning toward one another in a gesture so intimate, it felt alive. And around their feet, roses had rooted deep into the marble, their vines glowing faintly as if feeding from what lay beneath. The traveler felt a chill that was not cold. This is their tomb, they whispered. The widow queen and her worker. The words felt familiar, though they did not know why. They had heard the legend once in some distant village, told by an old man by the fire, the queen who defied death for love, the man who offered his soul to her darkness. Together they slept beneath the world, holding the balance between night and dawn. But here, now, the story did not feel like myth. It felt like truth. A soft wind passed through the ruins, and the roses bent as one, their petals fluttering like breath. The traveler knelt before the statues. Beneath the woman's stone hand, something glinted, a single rose petal, perfectly red, though centuries should have turned it to dust. They picked it up reverently. The petal pulsed once, faintly warm, then went still. Above them, the moon slipped from behind a cloud, flooding the courtyard in pale light. And in that glow, for the briefest heartbeat, the traveler thought they saw movement, the faintest flicker of life behind the marble eyes. The woman's lips parted in an almost smile. The man's fingers tightened imperceptibly around hers. It could have been illusion. It could have been the trick of moonlight. But the traveler felt something shift inside their chest, a quiet warmth blooming where loneliness had lived too long. They looked up at the red roses swaying around them, their petals glittering with dew and frost. So you kept your promise, the traveler whispered. Even time couldn't take it from you. The air shimmered faintly again, not a voice this time, but a feeling rising like music from the earth. It was not grief or longing, but peace. A pulse beneath the soil, steady as a sleeping heart. A warmth that said, balance endures, love remembers. The traveler placed the rose petal at the feet of the statues and bowed their head. When they rose to leave, the moonlight shifted once more, and the two figures seemed to glow faintly, silver and crimson, the light of life and death intertwined. Their eyes, one mortal, one immortal, would forever meet across eternity, their union carved into stone so the world would not forget that love, when it is true, does not fade. It transforms. As the traveler disappeared into the trees, snow began to fall again, gentle and slow, blanketing the ruins. The roses did not wither. They shone brighter, their crimson deepening like living fire. And when the wind carried the sound of distant bells, perhaps from some unseen village, perhaps only the echo of time, it bore a whisper soft as memory. Love and work are both hungers, one just kills slower. That night, beneath the eternal moon, the garden of red roses bloomed as though the world itself had remembered what it once forgot, that even decay can birth beauty, and that love, when it roots deep enough, becomes the bridge between mortality and forever.